Okay, good morning, Year 12. Welcome back to a bit of fun psychology. So you have finished attachment. Well done. I hope it went okay. I am going to chug on and power through and get you to teach yourself the next module. Depending on when we come back, I think I'm not going to have time to reteach or go over anything that I set during lockdown. So we will try to catch up with some of the areas you found tricky in revision. Hopefully, we finish around March time, so we'll have a good couple of months focus on revision. So we'll pick up some of the areas you weren't sure of then. So we'll keep chugging through. Moving on to our next module, which is psychopathology. So the study of the mind, looking at a variety of different mental illness. So I've got a couple of starter to do with you. So you can think in your head the answer to these questions. The number of people who suffer from a mental health problem in the UK over the course of a year is what? That is 1 in 4. So 1 in 4 people will suffer from any kind of mental health problem. Percentage of children that have a mental health problem at any one time, about 10%. I'm sure that's going to be on the rise, especially with the circumstances right now. Most common mental disorder in Britain is depression. Who's more likely to be treated, women, men, or adolescents? That's women. There's lots of reasons as to why that is. Some people think that men and women suffer the same, but women are more likely to go and ask for help and therefore be diagnosed. Depression, how many does it affect? 1 in 5 older people. That's pretty high, to be fair. And the percentage of people who agree that mental illness is an illness like any other, so they classify mental illness the same as a physical illness, 77% in a recent survey. That's quite high. That's pretty scary. So where we are then, psychopathology, a brand new colour scheme for a brand new module. And what it looks like is this. So we're going to be looking at OCD, we're going to be looking at phobias, we're going to be looking at depression and the different ways which it's classified. So a behaviour perspective, a cognitive perspective, a biological perspective, and how we treat them. Okay, so you might have some kind of background knowledge on this already, which is great. It's quite a short section, so it shouldn't take us too long, 2-3 weeks to get through. And yeah, then we'll see where we are then. So today then is looking at abnormality. So how do we define somebody as being abnormal? We've got 4 types to have a look at, definitions of abnormality. We need to look at the characteristics of each, a question you could be asked that's quite common. What are the characteristics of deviation from social norms, for example? And then we need to apply it to some real life examples to see if we can classify each of them. It's very easy to get some of them mixed up. So we need to make sure we can do that well. So psychopathology, what actually is it? So it's literally disease of the mind. Okay, so a nice little definition you could put into an essay, psychopathology, obviously depending on what the question is looking at the disease. It's a disease of the mind. And it's the study that looks at a combination. So mental, emotional, and behavioural problems. It looks at the classification. How do we know that somebody is suffering from depression? What are the causes? How can we treat it? Okay, so it's a combination of all those things to give us a well-rounded idea of somebody suffering from an illness. So a little task you can do. Excuse me, read the following scenarios and rate how abnormal you think these situations are. So you can do that, put it on a scale of 1 to 10. Do you think which one's the most abnormal to significantly normal? And that task, what that is there to do is set you up to define and determine what is normal and what is abnormal. What is the way that we classify it? So these are the 4 things that we need to know inside out, which we'll look at this lesson. So statistical infrequency, deviation from social norms, failure to function adequately, and deviation from mental or ideal mental health. So these 4 definitions help us classify what is normal and what is abnormal. And you'll need to know all 4. They could ask you to describe and evaluate one or more of these definitions or all 4 of them. Okay, so we need to know them inside out. Starting with probably what I think is the trickiest, statistical infrequency. So if we think about it, what could we mean if we break that down? So it's looking at things that are extremely rare. So behaviours in society that, because there's potentially not many of them, we would classify that as being abnormal. And it could be things like, excuse me, having a ridiculously high IQ would be classified as you being abnormal because it is very rare. So it uses descriptive statistics, our mean, our median, our mode, to investigate what is normal and what is abnormal. So through questionnaires, through surveys, take an average, and then we come up with a normal distribution. So it's useful because it gives us an idea about certain milestones, for example. So, what age is an infant expected to talk? What age do most people get married? So an example from sociology is that, more women are waiting till they're at least 30 to get married. And we know that from looking at statistics within society, carrying out questionnaires or interviews and taking an average. So if we're aware of the normal values, it gives us an understanding of what is, an untypical or atypical behaviour, which makes it abnormal, okay? So what is infrequent in society? So either having a really high IQ or a really low IQ is statistically infrequent. And it kind of will, if we take number of births, for example, this is our mean. This is considered abnormal, people over 40. This is considered abnormal, people under 20, okay, because our average is here. And it then looks like this. So it gives us a normal distribution graph, or the bell curve as we call it. So if we take phobias as another example, if I ask you all to rate your phobias of dogs, 1 is no fear, 10 is panic, we'd expect our normal distribution, our average, to be in the middle here. So we've got people who, are absolutely terrified, that's quite rare, and those people who are not terrified, that's quite rare, and then in the middle. Okay, so it gives us this bell curve. So that's our first one, statistical infrequency. Next is deviation from social norms. Now, a social norm, we've discussed a couple of times, is basically just what is acceptable in society. So abnormal behaviour is seen as going against these unwritten rules. Anything that goes against it is abnormal. So unlike the statistical norms, which we've looked at, social norms are socially constructed. So people decide what is a norm in society. If you go against that, you're abnormal. So politeness, saying please and thank you, queuing, smiling at strangers. Some rules are enforced, but these could be more significant because you are socially punished for or left out for not taking part in these social norms. Okay, so you could get bullied, you could be segregated from the group. I mean, I had a guy who I lived with at uni who had knives in his bedroom. That to me is a deviation from social norms. Knives live in the kitchen, okay? That's, he was segregated, yeah, because he was weird. Some other examples, so homosexuality. Abnormal in the 60s, it was a mental disorder, decriminalised in 67, and then, it's socially acceptable. There's no, there's not much prejudice against it, but that's because it's a cultural shift. Times change. Things like paedophilia, in some countries, so in Germany, if you go to a doctor and say you're having these feelings towards children, you won't get put on a sex offenders register, you don't get arrested, you get given treatment. Whereas, it's socially unacceptable, of course, it's breaking the law, it deviates from what is seen as normal. So think of some other examples that deviate from what we abide by in society. There's one of my year 12s last year said putting the milk in before the hot water and making a cup of tea. Oh, God. That's just disgusting. Failure to function adequately, or failure to adequately function, is based on how people go in their day-to-day life. So things they can't do, things they can do, what's causing them stress is considered a sign of abnormality. So things like being able to get up, have a shower, have breakfast, sleep properly, perform your role in society means you're functioning adequately. But others, so schizophrenics, tend to not have an awareness that anything is wrong. They don't understand that what they're doing isn't viewed as normal. So it doesn't necessarily apply to everybody. And then if they're not performing adequately, they're considered abnormal. Now, if we take coronavirus it's going to be used as so many examples for everything. Some days I really struggle to get out of bed, get myself motivated and do some work. Whereas other days, totally fine. And I think this is the problem with this explanation, is that we all have off days. We all have those days where we just cannot get ourselves motivated. Does that mean we're abnormal? And this is the problem with the explanation. If we take an example then of bipolar disorder, so you can bring in these examples to really boost up your AO1. Lack of appetite, difficulty sleeping, suicidal thoughts, lack of energy, all of that would say that you are abnormal. And, our DSM, have we come across DSM yet? No, I don't think so. So the Diagnosis Statistical Manual is there to classify mental illness. So it's what doctors use, psychiatrists use to decide whether or not you are suffering from a mental illness. So they rate each item in bold of 1 to 5, given a score, and therefore an assessment of abnormality would say that they are how they are functioning, if they are functioning adequately or not. And that's going to vary from different individual. Mostly women who suffer from schizophrenia or bipolar function better than men because maybe they can hide it better, they can control it better. But yeah, it's quite an interesting example to look at. Then lastly is deviation from ideal mental health. Now, these two are very similar and they do cross over. What this is, though, is based on what mental health should be in an idealistic world. So having a positive attitude, having resistance to stress, an accurate perception of reality. And Jehoda came up with 6 categories that she stated, a woman, oh my God, I know, they're one of the first women that we look at in psychology, that define physical illness by looking at we define physical illness by looking at the absence of disease. And she pretty much says that good mental health is the absence of abnormality in day-to-day life. So she came up with 6 different categories that means you are, or that you have, an ideal mental health. Okay, so you'll have a high self-esteem, you have personal growth, you've got ambition, you can cope with stressful situations, you're independent, you have a good idea of reality, and you master your environment. You can love, you function at work, you've got good relationships, you adjust well, and you're a problem solver. I mean, Jesus, that is ridiculous. Who can fulfill all of those 6 things all of the time? Okay, she says if you've got an absence of just one of these, you might have a mental health disorder. So just think about how realistic it is to have all of those 6 things all of the time. Okay, it's not. I'm going to put that out there. It is not. So she would argue that you then suffer from a mental health illness if you don't have all 6. Okay, things like anorexia, low self-esteem, reliance on others, inaccurate perception of reality and what you physically look like. All of those would demonstrate a deviation from ideal mental health. So how do we use them? And if they're that useful, how do they go about helping to treat mental health conditions? So I want you to have a think, which is the best definition and why, and which is the worst definition and why, because you could have a question that says, describe and evaluate one or more. So you'd want to talk about two of those, and then maybe bring in a third in sort of a conclusive paragraph. They could give you one, so say statistical infrequency, and ask you to just choose another. So you need to know them all really well to be able to talk about them. But just weigh up what are the pros and cons of some of a couple of them. Then if you're struggling, or if you want a bit of practice, which I would definitely do, I've got some short 2-mark questions there you can have a go at, and you can send to me if you want me to mark them. And then we need to look at some of the evaluation of it. So we've spoke through a little bit of the evaluation. So we've said that some of them just aren't realistic, aren't relevant, cross over. So let's delve into that a little bit further. So I've got a recap slide here that you can print out and use if you want. That's just got the very bare basics of the AO1. Then we'll delve into each of them and evaluate them fully. So what you could do, because I've got the briefs here, you could either pick one and do a lovely detailed peel paragraph, or you could peel paragraph them all. So that structure is really important. And my worry is that in some of your essays, I'm just seeing the paragraph from the book sort of copied, and I don't want it to be copied word for word because you're not linking it to the question. Some of you aren't saying this means that, however, therefore, so we're missing some of those connectives that will really boost your marks to really link it back to that question. That's the key bit. So where do we start then? Quite a lot to get through. So statistical infrequency doesn't necessarily take into account that some abnormal behaviour is actually really desirable and useful in society. So having a really high IQ or abnormal intelligence, that's not a negative thing. That's a positive. You're bringing something to society that, you know, is really, really useful. For example, quite a few people there's a program a couple of years ago about disabilities and how they don't necessarily get equal opportunities in going for a position in a job. And I found out a couple of years ago that the MOD will only hire, or are quite specific in who they hire for, I can't remember what the role is, but they actually look for people with autism because they're very focused, they're very controlled on one specific thing, which can help pick out patterns. So having a mental illness having a really high IQ or suffering from a neurological disorder like autism can actually be really positive. So not all things that we value or things that we see as abnormal are negative. The cutoff point, so what we decide to be abnormal and normal is subjective. And that makes it quite difficult to say what is and isn't classified as abnormal. So if we take sleep, for example, if you sleep less than 80% of the population do, so if you get less than 8 hours sleep, you're considered abnormal. That's terrible for your health. You're going to struggle to develop cognitively. But some think maybe it should be 90%. You know, how do we know the scientific distinction between abnormal and normal? Okay, so that's a negative. Then sometimes it is appropriate. So if we take intellectual disability, so having a really low IQ, using the normal distribution graph can be helpful because it shows that actually we do need to put some treatment into place. And maybe it's just the lower half of the normal distribution that we should be intervening with, whereas the, statistically low at the higher end actually should be supported and should be left to flourish. Whereas at the negative end, maybe we do need to have a bit of support. Okay, so in that way, it can be useful. Deviation from social norms then is 100% open to abuse. Okay, so norms change over time, cultures change. We go through cultural shifts all the time. So what we deem to be socially acceptable now, in the past wouldn't be, in the future, some things that we deem abnormal now will become normal. So this definition means that, people who label individuals, so doctors, psychiatrists, as mentally ill, maybe they don't conform to what the society's expectations are. Maybe it's very subjective to them. So when it comes to a mental illness diagnosis, we can argue that doctors and psychiatrists are powerful in society. They can decide whether or not you are labelled as having depression, or you need to be sectioned or have these prescription medication. So it could be a way of, this is what SARS says, it's a way of labelling and controlling the deviant people in society. Okay, a more liberal person would say actually it's to help them, it's to benefit them, but you can see how it could be potentially open to some abuse. Deviance, sociologists will look at this in year 13, and a little bit in forensics actually, is related to context and degree. So what we view to be deviant changes in the situation we are in, and is very subjective. So being naked on a nudist beach isn't deviant. In a classroom, that's a mental disorder, you'll get arrested. So the line as to what is abnormal and normal is far from clear, because situations are constantly renegotiating that idea of normal and abnormal. Okay, so that's something to be mindful of. But we do have some strengths. It allows the distinction between desirable and undesirable. It takes into account the impact that behaviours can have on others and their perception of them. But ultimately, there are more negatives than positives. Failure to function adequately. So again, this is an interesting one. Who judges whether or not somebody is functioning normally? So again, it's subjective. The patient can recognise they have a failure to function, but other people are making this judgment of them. Okay, so if there's a miscommunication, or the psychiatrist thinks that you're not functioning normally, but you think actually it's okay, they have the power ultimately. So that again is a weakness. The behaviour may be quite functional, so some abnormal behaviour is actually quite adaptive. So if we take mental disorders like eating disorders, it can lead to the patient receiving more attention, therefore getting help and treatment. And therefore maybe it's not as dysfunctional as we think, because they're doing it to get the help they need. So, some people always talk about people who are struggling, just doing it for a cry for help. Well, we hope so, because then they can get the help. Okay, so that's quite an interesting take on that. And then some of the strengths of this failure to function adequately. It recognises the subjective experience of the individual. It allows them to view it from the point of view of the patient. And it's easy to judge because we're using the DSM, so you can measure it in an objective, scientific way, which means that the drugs you're administering are relevant and for the best treatment. Then lastly, deviation from ideal mental health. So we said this already, that 6 criteria from Jehoda is unrealistic. You can't fit all of those 6 criteria all the time, every single day. Some of them actually are really hard to measure. So environmental mastery, how on earth do you measure that? For some people, it's going to be totally different. So it's, again, very subjective. Jehoda argues that mental health is the same as physical health. So remember, she said that the ideal physical health is the absence of, a condition. It's very reductionist to say that they are the same thing. In a physical illness, it's a bacteria and we can cure it, but mental disorders sometimes have biological causes, so an imbalance of hormones or a genetic predisposition. Therefore, you can't diagnose it in the same way, and that becomes an issue for the NHS because they can't be as specific as they can with physical health. Then this approach is actually quite positive because it focuses on the positives of what a person has opposed to which an individual is lacking and what is desirable as opposed to undesirable. So whilst quite a few of them have taken it on board, it has influenced some of this positive psychology movement into mental health. So it has got some relevance, but ultimately it's pretty negative. So actually, when it comes to weighing them up, I mean, they're not the best ways of looking at abnormality, I would say. So the best thing I could say to do now is, I think I've sent you an essay on it already, but you could do like a big Venn diagram and do a bit of comparisons between them. What does one have that the other doesn't, and vice versa? And I think that would give you quite a nice overview of those definitions of abnormality.